Good morning, everybody. Welcome back for week 2, Science Politics. Welcome to all of our colleagues and friends joining us from a more locked down state in some places. So where I want to start is, first of all, just to let you know that I have released the topics that we'll be doing in the second half of the course. 2 of them are not 100% confirmed in the dates. I'm just waiting for someone to get back to me to tell me what date is good for them. But if you scroll down in the Wattle page, you'll be able to see all of the list of topics that we will be doing. So first up, mandatory bike helmets. I think I might have promised that to other people. Masks, the sugar tax, or a sugar tax, or sugar taxes in general, pill testing, machine learning, and then building in the bush. So have a look through these now, and you can choose the topics that are of interest to you. You don't have to tell me. I don't need to know what topics you are doing until you submit your questions and your opinion pieces. But choose them based on what you're interested in, or potentially what might suit with your other assessment calendar. And remember, 3 topics for undergraduates and 4 topics for postgraduates. In each of those, you need to do the collaborative literature review and the question for the guest expert, and then an opinion piece. If you aren't doing a particular topic, you don't need to do any of those bits, but by all means, join us in class and listen along. You would be very, very welcome there. Did anyone have any questions on the topics before we dive into today's class? No? Excellent. Well, today what I want to do is explore the process by which policy is made. Policy is the outcome of politics, or an outcome of politics. Now, we could explore how policy is made from thousands of different perspectives. Of course, you could explore it with an Australia-specific perspective. You would look at, how does the federal parliament make legislation and make policy, or a state-specific perspective, how Victoria, Queensland, ACT makes legislation. Or you can explore it from another country, or from different organisations. We will do a little bit of that, but I don't want to teach you too much about the particularities of the federal parliament here in Australia. You can look a lot of those things up. Instead, I want to explore more general cases, how policy is made. I'm going to do this with at least 1 story, potentially 2 if we have time. One story will tell us a lot about how policy is made. The second one tells us something bad. But anyway, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully what I won't do, I'm going to go into Keynote. I won't go into maximum or whatever it's called. It's filling your screen, so that then I can see your chat window and your raising your hand. So if anyone does have any questions as we go throughout this, hopefully I can still see if you've raised your hands. I'm not sure. No, you've disappeared. Ha. I wish I could do that. That's so frustrating. It takes away the chat window. Unless, oh no, I've got the chat window there. I can get the chat window, and I can get, I can't see if you've raised your hands, unless I do. That might help me a little bit, but I can see the chat window. So just yell out if you have any questions. Now, I want to start this with a long way back in time, because this starts with a person, and then they discovered a problem, and then other problem. Yeah, I would click the participants icon, but it goes away for me once you start sharing your screen, unfortunately. It's just one of the quirks of Zoom. Oh, maybe that, okay. All right, got it, excellent. May 18th, 1889. Thomas Midgley Jr. was born in Beaver Falls, the son of a family of inventors. His dad, in fact, was a prolific inventor in the car tire field. His mother's father had invented the inserted tooth saw. When he was about 4, Midgley moved with the family to Trenton, New Jersey, and then to Columbus, Ohio, where he'd spend much of the rest of his life. Midgley grew up attending public schools in Columbus. He was always interested in athletics, and he played on the high school baseball and football teams. And here comes Midgley's first invention. When the spitball first began to be used by baseball players, now, any baseball players here? What's a spitball? I think it's a way that they pitch where you put some spit on it and spins in a certain direction. That's not the point of the story here. Midgley and one of his teammates began to search for a substance to give the ball enough slipperiness to make it have the maximum curving effect. Midgley hit on the idea of using an extract of the inner bark of the slippery elm tree as an aid to that end, and a practice which was later followed extensively in the professional baseball leagues, which is, I think you have to say, a pretty big invention for a high schooler. After high school, Midgley went on to Cornell University, graduating in 1911 with a degree in mechanical engineering. In 1916, Midgley began working at General Motors. Now, here comes the first problem. At the time, cars had a really annoying problem called knocking. Now, you wouldn't know this because this is long before any cars that we drive, but knocking, or it's also called spark knocking, pinging, pinking, detonation, in the spark ignition internal combustion engines occurs when the combustion of some of the air-fuel mixture in the cylinder doesn't result from propagation of the flame front ignited by the spark plug, but one or more pockets of air-fuel mixture explode outside the envelope of the normal combustion front. So it's basically like backfiring. So it's something that you don't want in your internal combustion engine. Now, the shock wave created by this unplanned combustion creates the characteristic metallic pinging sound, and the cylinder pressure increases dramatically. Effects on the engine range from inconsequential, it's an annoying sound, to completely destructive. I don't know if it blew up any cars or anything like that, but it might have caused some sorts of problems. But it was annoying enough that people were really focused on working it. So, Thomas Midgley, while he was working at the Dayton Research Labs of General Motors, discovered that the addition of tetraethyl lead to gasoline prevented knocking. The company named the substance ethyl. They thought that ethyl sounds nicer than tetraethyl lead, avoiding all mention of lead in reports and manufacturing. Oil companies and car manufacturers, especially General Motors, which owned the patent, jointly filed, promoted tetraethyl lead, or TEL, as an inexpensive alternative superior to ethanol or ethanol-based fuels on which they could make very little profit. In December 1922, the American Chemical Society awarded Midgley the 1923 Nichols Medal for the use of anti-knock compounds in motor fuels. And this was one of the first of several major awards he earned during his career. Ominously, though, in 1923, this was how many years? 7 years after he'd started working at General Motors, Midgley took a long vacation in Florida to cure himself of lead poisoning. Might have been an ominous sign for the world. He found that his lungs had been affected and that it's necessary to drop all work and get a large supply of fresh air. Potentially one of the greatest examples of Florida Man, if anyone follows the Florida Man, the world's worst superhero Twitter thread. Or it's not even a Twitter thread. I don't know. There's also Florida Boy. I do like Florida Boy. And Florida Teen. Florida Teen is great. In April 1923, General Motors created the General Motors Chemical Company to supervise the production of tetraethyl lead by the DuPont Company. Midgley was the vice president of this. However, after 2 deaths and several cases of lead poisoning at the prototype plant in Ohio, the staff was said in 1924 to be depressed to the point of considering giving up the whole tetraethyl lead program. Over the next year, 8 more people died at the DuPont plant in New Jersey. One story has that the plant was plagued by more cases. Sorry, just pausing for a sec. There we go. Where was I? The plant was plagued by lots and lots of cases of lead poisoning, hallucinations, insanity, and 5 deaths. In 1924, Midgley participated in a press conference to demonstrate the apparent safety of tetraethyl lead, in which he poured tetraethyl lead over his hands placed a bottle of the chemical under his nose, and inhaled the vapor for 60 seconds, declaring that he could do this every day without succumbing to every problems. That is, of course, a form of science communication, but it's not a good one. So don't do that. However, the state of New Jersey ordered the Bayway plant to be closed for a few days, and Jersey Stand was forbidden to manufacture tetraethyl lead again without state permission. Midgley would later have to take another leave of absence from work after being diagnosed with lead poisoning. Lead in petrol was a huge problem, and it took many decades to solve. In fact, there are strong stories that key fractions of the amount of violence in societies, particularly in the 60s and 70s, were about lead in the atmosphere from lead in the fuel, that children growing up breathing in that lead contributed directly to violence. So in 2011, 89 years after it was invented, the United Nations announced that it had been successful in phasing out leaded gasoline worldwide. Ridding the world of leaded petrol, with the United Nations leading the effort in developing countries, has resulted in $2.4 trillion in annual benefits, 1.2 million fewer premature deaths, higher overall intelligence. Everyone, all of us, we're all smarter once we took lead out of the fuel. And 58 million fewer crimes, the United Nations Environmental Program said. It's actually a huge thing, getting lead out of petrol. Lead was a huge environmental crime, and it caused so much damage to all of us. But that's not the story that I want to focus on today. I want to focus on Thomas Midgley's next invention, which was perhaps not as bad, but pretty close. In the late 1920s, air conditioning and refrigeration systems employed compounds such as ammonia, chloromethane, propane, and sulfur dioxide as refrigerants. These were all effective in the sense that they worked as a refrigerant, but they were also toxic, flammable, or explosives. So I don't know which of those you want in your kitchen. Probably none. Probably none. The Frigidaire division of General Motors, at that time a leading manufacturer of such systems, sought a non-toxic, non-flammable alternative to these refrigerants. And when you think about it like that, that's not a bad thing at all. I think if we're running a fridge, you probably want your fridge to be non-toxic, non-flammable, not like those terrible 1920s fridges. So the General Motors Research Corporation assembled a team to work on the problem. And here comes our hero, Thomas Midgley Jr. again. The team soon narrowed their focus to alkyl halides. And at this point, I just got to confess that I'm not a chemistry person. So if I get the pronunciation of any chemical wrong, sing out, help me to get it right. And there's some coming up here that will be quite tongue twisting for me. They narrowed their focus to the alkyl halides, a combination of carbon chains and halogens, which were known to be highly volatile. That was what they required for being a refrigerant, and also chemically inert. They eventually settled on the concept of incorporating fluorine into a hydrocarbon. They rejected the assumption that such compounds would be toxic, believing that the stability of the chlorine-fluorine bond would be sufficient to prevent the release of hydrogen fluoride or potential breakdown products. The team eventually synthesized dichloro-difluoromethane, the first chlorofluorocarbon, or CFC, which they named Freon. This compound is commonly referred to today as Freon 12 or R12. Freon and the other CFCs soon largely replaced other refrigerants and later appeared in other applications such as propellants in aerosols, spray cans, and asthma inhalers. And again, Thomas Midgley was awarded for his work. This time he got the Society of the Chemical Industry Award, Perkin Medal in 1937 for his award. As you can guess, this was not great for the environment. In 1913, French physicist Charles Fabry and Henri Poisson set out to measure the radiation sent out from the surface of the sun and reaching the ground. They took the measurements they took were consistent with the spectrum of a black body with the temperature in the range of 5,000 to 6,000 Kelvin, except that there was no radiation below a wavelength of about 310 nanometers at the ultraviolet end of the spectrum. I'll show you a graph here that tries to make sense of what they were finding. This is a little bit later in their story. But what they were saying is that there's one wavelength missing. We should be getting a random assortment of wavelengths from the sun, but something was missing. It was deduced that the missing radiation was being absorbed by something in the atmosphere. Eventually, the spectrum of the missing radiation was matched to only one known chemical, ozone. An honorary mark. Sorry, that was a joke from a previous course that people are putting there in the chat. Over the next few decades, the properties of this layer were explored in detail by the British meteorologist G.M.B. Dobson, who developed a simple spectrophotometer, which he called the Dobsonometer, which again, if you make an invention, you get to name it after yourself. It's a little bit something. You have to wait for someone else to say it, I think. That's what you should do. Just wait for someone else to call it the Grantometer or something like that. That could be used to measure stratospheric ozone from the ground. Between 1928 and 1958, Dobson established a worldwide network of ozone monitoring stations, which actually continue working to this day. He also, because he invented the Dobson meter, he also invented the Dobson unit, which is a convenient measure of the amount of ozone overhead. So, what actually is the ozone layer? The ozone layer, I think other people have called it the ozone shield at some point, but definitely ozone layer in everything I heard about when I was a kid, when it was probably top of the pops for the global scientific worry, I think, yeah, worry. I wouldn't say panic, is a region in the stratosphere. Somewhere between, the stratosphere is between 8 and 60 kilometers up, that absorbs most of the ultraviolet radiation. Top of the pops reference. It contains high concentration of, you guessed it, ozone in relation to the other parts of the atmosphere, although still small in relation to all the other gases. It contains less than 10 parts per million of ozone, while the average ozone concentration in the Earth's atmosphere as a whole is like 0.3 parts per million. So it goes from not very much at all to a bit. So it's not like it's a layer thick with ozone. It's just got a bit more than everywhere else. The ozone layer is mainly found in the lower portion of the atmosphere, from 15 to 35 kilometers above the Earth. Now, the basic physical and chemical processes that led to the formation of the ozone layer were discovered by Sidney Chapman in 1930. Anyone want to do the physics of how it works? So looking at that graph there, shortwave radiation coming from the sun splits an O2 molecule into 2 oxygen atoms, which then combine with other oxygen molecules to form ozone. Ozone is removed when an oxygen atom and an ozone molecule recombine to form 2 oxygen molecules. That's cool. But the key thing is that the ozone layer, as was discovered later, does significant work in protecting us and all life on Earth from UVB and a bit of UVA radiation. Significant protection there. Now, in 1950s, David Bates and Marcel Nicolet presented evidence that various free radicals, in particular hydroxyl and nitrogen oxide, could catalyze this recombination reaction, reducing the overall amount of ozone. These free radicals were known to be present in the stratosphere, and so regarded as part of the natural balance. But in 1970, Paul Crutzen pointed out that emissions of nitrogen oxide, which is a stable, long-lived gas produced by soil bacteria, from the Earth's surface, could affect the amount of nitric oxide in the stratosphere. Crutzen showed that nitrous oxide lives long enough to reach the stratosphere, where it's converted into nitric oxide. He then noted that increasing use of fertilizers might have led to an increase in nitrous oxide emissions over the natural background. So he's thinking maybe fertilizers are affecting the amount of ozone in the ozone layer. What he's starting to think here in 1970s is that human activity could have effect on the stratospheric ozone layer. In 1974, Frank Sherwood Rowland, chemistry professor, and at this point on, pay attention to the dates. It's really interesting what happens here. So 1974, Frank Sherwood Rowland, chemistry professor at the University of California, and his postdoc, Mario J. Molina, suggested that long-lived organic compound halogen compounds, such as CFCs, might behave in a similar fashion as Crutzen had proposed for nitrous oxide. They concluded CFCs would reach the atmosphere where they would be disassociated by UV light, releasing chlorine atoms. Basically, when these ozone-depleting chemicals reach the stratosphere, they're disassociated by ultraviolet light to release chlorine atoms. And it breaks down the ozone up there. Now, it might take 5 to 7 years for a CFC molecule to get from the surface of the Earth into the stratosphere, but it can stay up there for maybe a century, destroying up to 100,000 ozone molecules during that time. One molecule destroys 100,000 molecules. Early estimates were that if CFC production continued at 1977 levels, the total atmospheric ozone after a century or so at a steady state would be 15 to 18% below normal levels. Later, this estimate was revised down to 5 to 9% below steady state depletion. But a new discovery in 1985 made everything more dramatic. British Antarctic Survey scientists published a paper in Nature that sent a shockwave through the scientific community. And again, here, 1985, showing the observed decline in polar ozone was far larger than anyone had anticipated. So here's the abstract to the paper. You can see it there. Recent attempts to consolidate assessments on the effect of human activities on stratospheric ozone using one-dimensional models for 30 degrees north, so Arctic Circle, have suggested that perturbations of total ozone will remain small for at least the next decade. Results from such models are often accepted as by default as global estimates. The inadequacy of this approach is here made evident by observations that the spring values of total ozone in Antarctica have now fallen considerably. You can see that chart on the side there. The circulation in the lower stratosphere is apparently unchanged, and possible chemical causes must be considered. We suggest that the very low temperatures which prevail from midwinter until several weeks after the spring equinox make the Antarctic stratosphere uniquely sensitive to the growth of inorganic chlorine, primarily by the effect of this growth on the whatever ratio chemical. This, with the high distribution of UV radiation peculiar to the polar atmosphere, could account for the ozone losses observed. So at this point, what they're showing is that there is something different going on over the poles. At this point, people are starting to talk about a hole in the ozone layer. Satellite measurements showing massive depletion of the ozone around the South Pole were becoming available at the time. And so here is a pretty common picture from the time. Obviously, it's a colorized image to show in Dobson units the level of ozone in different areas of the planet, but we are seeing huge gaps in the ozone concentration directly above Antarctica and starting to get above a bit of South America. But it's also looking at the green just there, and it is covering up to New Zealand and covering parts of Australia. Now, when these maps were initially rejected as unreasonable by data quality control algorithms, but the ozone layer was detected. It was detected in satellite data when the raw data was reprocessed, and in fact, it was shown in earlier satellite images where they hadn't seen it back to 1976. So, why the holes? It seems to be something to do with the cold. So there is a small hole in the ozone layer above Tibet and the Himalayan plateau, where you get a lot of cold air, and that cold seems to accelerate the CFC reaction. So and here we have to start by thinking not just what the hole was, but what are the potential consequences of this? Now, there's, just to flag here, two things going on in this problem. Obviously, CFCs, as was established at this time, are causing this problem, but there is a global decrease in ozone all over the place by 5 to 9%. But there are also larger intensities in that, I'll go that way, larger intensities in decrease over the poles. Now, what that meant is that for a lot of people, it wasn't the biggest problem, but it certainly could lead to enormous jumps in skin cancer rate. So this was mainly a thing where people were worried about the effect directly on human health. By combining epidemiological data with results of animal studies, scientists estimated that every 1% decrease in the long-term stratospheric ozone, and remember we're talking 5 to 9 globally, would increase the incidence of various types of skin cancers by 2%. So what we're talking here is potentially getting up to 10 to 20% increases in skin cancers. And so I do remember in the mid 80s, I think this is still from, it's Robocop. It became a big part of pop culture, this idea that suddenly we would not be able to go out safely into the sun, that any form obviously of sunbathing, but even going out into the sun would be extremely hazardous to us. Now, perhaps that was hyperbole, perhaps that was further than was actually warranted, but people were really quite concerned about this. So scientists have actually measured the actual consequences of this. And so they've shown, for example, in the southern tip of Chile and the southern tip of Argentina, an increase of 56% in melanoma over a 7-year period. They've also found significant rises in Highlander 2 had a major plot about the ozone layer. Oh my God, there can only be one. Another study looking at whales found significant growth in sun damage. Obviously, whales spend a lot of time in the far reaches of the Arctic poles. So let's flip now. We've got a good idea of what the problem is. So over the 50 years, we've established 3 things. We've established one, that CFCs deplete ozone. 2, that we have that the ozone layer itself is globally thinning, and holes are forming over cold areas, in particular the poles. Consequences of this are direct increases in skin cancers amongst humans and animals of twice the rate of the thinning of the ozone layer. So how was the problem communicated? Well, from the mid 1980s, the issue became a really hot issue. A lot of people were talking about it. People feared personal consequences, skin cancers and cataracts, and also damage to plants and reduction of plankton populations in the ocean. It generated a huge amount of public interest. Oh, we don't need to see that one now. That's all. I'll come back to that. Many worried that ozone holes might start appearing over other areas of the globe, although there hasn't been very much of this actually happen. Stratospheric conditions will become cooler, then global ozone may decrease at a greater pace. So they were worrying this might be the start of something getting worse. And globally, people became talking about the ozone layer as a metaphor for everything else. This captured global attention. I'll just skip ahead to here. That from the 1980s, we started talking enormously about the hole in the ozone layer. Now, it did actually get quite entangled with the rise of the communication of climate change. And there are a lot of people that were quite confused at the same time, legitimately, that these were the same thing going on, or that they affected each other, or that they pulled in different directions. And it was very hard. I remember my dad reading New Scientist in the 1980s, and they would almost alternate cover for cover, hole in the ozone layer, climate change, as which was the most compelling issue. Both incredibly worrying for lots of people. Industry responded, which is interesting. Initially, the hypothesis that CFCs might catalyze and hence deplete ozone was strongly disputed by representatives of the aerosol and hydrocarbon industries. What a surprise. They just said that, look, we don't need to worry about this, just like industries already do. The chair of the board of DuPont, I remember DuPont was the original producers and inventors of CFCs, said the ozone depletion theory is a science fiction tale, a load of rubbish, utter nonsense. Robert Abplanalp, A-B-P-L-A-N-A-L-P, the president of Precision Valve Corporation and inventor of the first practical aerosol spray can valve, wrote to the Chancellor of UC Irvine to complain about Rowland's public statements. So they're writing directly to the scientist's boss to say, you shouldn't be able to say this because you just shouldn't. Nevertheless, within 3 years, by 1977, this is well before the actual hole in the ozone layer was discovered, most of the basic assumptions made by Rowland and Molina were confirmed by lab measurements and by direct observation in the stratosphere. So they were measuring throughout the stratosphere and demonstrated that CFCs were up there in the stratosphere and were the major source of decline in the ozone hole, in the ozone layer, sorry. Even more convincing was the measurement by some that chlorine monoxide in the atmosphere. Chlorine monoxide is produced only by the reaction of chlorine with ozone. So it was demonstrated straight away that chlorine monoxide is up there, so it had to come from the CFCs going up into the atmosphere. In 1977, a report by the National Academy of Sciences, here we go, 1976, sorry, so 2 years after Molina's the first real publication here, concluded that credible scientific evidence supported the ozone depletion. Following this, a number of countries, including the United States, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, moved to ban the use of CFCs in aerosol spray cans. Individuals were also voluntarily began to move away from spray aerosol cans in a variety of countries. Progress slowed a little bit after those first moves, probably due to a few political factors, continued resistance from the halocarbon industry, and a general change in attitude towards environmental regulation during the first 2 years of the Reagan administration. So the US banned the use of CFCs in aerosol cans in 1978. The European community rejected proposals to ban CFCs in aerosol cans. And in the US, CFCs continue to be used in refrigerants and for cleaning circuit boards. Nevertheless, worldwide CFC production fell sharply after the US aerosol ban, but then it did come back in the 1980s as it found new uses. The US government attitude began to change again in 1983, perhaps following a change of leadership at the Environmental Protection Agency. At that point, they began to push strongly for an international approach to hydrocarbon regulation. In 1985, 20 nations, including most of the major CFC producers, signed the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer, which established a framework for negotiating international regulations on those sorts of chemicals. That's the same year, as I was saying, that the ozone hole was discovered. So all of this work to start banning aerosols and then to bring in an international regulation happened before any of the actual hole was discovered. And that's when the height of the panic, if we can call it a panic, I think it was legitimate, emerged. In 1987, representatives from 43 nations signed the Montreal Protocol, agreeing to phase out substances responsible for ozone depletion. DuPont may have feared court action at this point related to increased skin cancer. So here's where industry started to get worried about consequences. As the EPA had published a study in 1986 claiming that an additional 40 million skin cancer cases and 800,000 deaths were expected in the US over the next 88 years. So they were worried actually about the impact on mortality. The EU began to shift. Germany gave up its defense of the CFC industry, and more countries joined into the Montreal Protocol. Participants agreed to freeze production of CFCs at 1986 levels and to reduce production by 50% by 1999. They moved the phase out date to 1996, and basically from initially the major hydrocarbons claimed that there was no alternatives to CFCs. However, an ozone-safe hydrocarbon refrigerant was developed at Hamburg, at the Hamburg Technological Institute in Germany, and in 1992 came to the attention of Greenpeace. Greenpeace was given the patent, so a replacement for CFC that didn't cause these problems, given to Greenpeace. They called it Green Freeze and left the patent as open source. The NGO, Greenpeace, then began working with small, struggling companies to market an appliance in Europe and then in Asia and Latin America. And since 2004, more and more companies, so you've got brewing companies like Coca-Cola and Carlsberg, and then IKEA, forming a coalition to promote ozone-safe green freeze units. By 2008, all the big refrigeration companies, Electrolux, Bosch, LG, sales of up to 300 million refrigerators using green freeze. So the Montreal Protocol came into effect in 1989. Ozone levels stabilized in the mid-1990s and began to recover in the 2000s. Recovery is projected to take at least 100 years. The ozone hole is expected to reach pre-1980 levels in around 2075. Crutzen, Molina, and Rowland were awarded the 1995 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their work on stratospheric ozone. In 1940, at the age of just 51, Midgley contracted polio, which left him severely disabled. Ever the inventor, though, he devised an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys to lift himself out of bed while he stayed at home. But in 1944, he became entangled in the device and died of strangulation. That's the end of the Midgley story. I don't know if that's comeuppance, but he did bring about 2 awful chemicals into the world. Now, I'm just gonna jump over to here. What I want to explore is what we can learn from this process. What things assisted, what things got in the way of going from policy to problem. How did he die? He died of strangulation. He got entangled. Yeah, maybe it's karma. Maybe it's karma. Okay, now what I wanted to go is what we can learn from this example and how we might transfer it to other policymaking problems. Now, this is the chart that I want to start exploring because this shows the emergence. This is the Google Ngrams graph again, showing how much people are talking about, or talking in the sense of publications in books, how much people are talking about different problems. So you can see from here that it was not known about, non-existent prior to 1980. A small number of people started talking about it in 1980, and then suddenly in the middle of the 1980s, it takes off. People start talking about it. Then, at about 1990, at the peak of the graph there, you can see suddenly we're not talking about it as much because we've solved it. Maybe not 100%, but we've done a lot to solve it, and it becomes more of a metaphor. It's worth thinking about a few other different types of problems that give different graphs and start thinking about how problems emerge. So here is a graph of smog. Now, again, we can see a growth, small amounts of talking about a problem throughout the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and then it takes off as a problem that we start talking more and more and more about the problem of smog up until the 1970s. We gradually start solving. Sexually transmitted diseases. Most prevalent, it seems, at about 1995, or we talked about them the most in 1995. I assume sexually transmitted diseases have been around forever. Yes, these are Google Ngrams, Justin. These are just graphs of how much people are talking about different topics. So it gives us an idea of how much people are focusing on a problem, thinking about a problem, engaging it. Yes, so sexually transmitted diseases starts to usher in something. So whereas the hole in the ozone layer was a new problem that was discovered by science, smog was a new problem that was created by, well, both these problems were created by people gradually, and we started noticing and started talking about them. Hole in the ozone layer all of a sudden. Sexually transmitted diseases is not a new problem. We have had potentially, but the point being here that they weren't referred to as sexually transmitted diseases before. They were venereal diseases and then sexually transmitted infections afterwards. But the point being here that we had humans suffered from sexually transmitted infections throughout human history. But that our scientific lens, our public health lens, starting to pay attention to these as things that we could deal with. Now, is there a moral panic as we reach a peak and then we decline? I don't know. But there's, what is this one? Slavery. Slavery reached a peak in discussion in the US Civil War, but has been a continued part of human conversation. Slavery has always been a problem that people have attempted to solve. Slavery was talked about a lot during the American Civil War, and a lot was done to help solve the problem of slavery. Slavery continues. You'll see that uptick now that shows that more people are actually enslaved now than have ever been enslaved. So this is what I want to do. Policy making of any sort starts with the revealing of a problem. Now, those graphs hint at something useful in terms of what I mean by revealing of a problem. Some problems are new. So for example, the hole in the ozone layer or the thinning of the ozone layer is a problem that is actually new. The ozone was fine up until, well, the 1950s. And then we discovered that it was thinning in the 1970s. Some problems, slavery, sexually transmitted infections, are old. They've been with us for the whole time. But that doesn't mean that both of them might not be revealed. So for example, it took a lot of work to argue that slavery was an evil, or it took a lot of work to recognize that, hang on, sexually transmitted infections don't have to just be part of life, that we might discover this as a problem. Two, problems vary enormously in complexity. On the one hand, we have simple problems. Simple problems are the problems that don't often get to a government lens. They are problems where we can see a linear input and then we can see a linear output. More complex problems have a variety of things going in, a variety of inputs, and at the far end are wicked problems where we debate about the nature of the exact problem. Now, what I want to do is pause, because I've been speaking for a chunk of time here, and can you suggest any problems that you might think fit down the simple end? What would we define as a simple linear problem? You can raise your hands or you can throw them into the chat. Cholera. Wearing masks. Well, CFCs. Look, I'm going to put CFCs down as a fairly linear sort of problem. Definitely. Math problems. Yeah, math problems are simple, of course. Well, some of them are. Flossing. Whoa. Is that the dance or brushing? Flossing is not a problem. Dental hygiene may be a problem that we might work on. Microbeads. Yeah, microbeads are a great example. So microbeads are small bits of plastic, or sometimes other things, that have been added to a variety of cosmetic goods over what period? Maybe only the last 10 years, I don't know. And we have discovered they don't break down and they cause a lot of harm to marine life. We now have an ocean that's basically plastic. But in terms of a simple problem, we have two components to that, basically. One, how do we stop them going out there? And two, how do we get rid of them? Now, how do we get rid of them? That might be a trickier one, but how do we stop them going in? We have a limited number of people that are putting these things in there. And so we can, we can definitely have a look at, okay, what are the various inputs here and how complex is this going on? Seatbelts, car fatalities. Car fatalities, I'd say in general, is probably a complex problem because there's a lot of different vectors, but we can intervene with seatbelts definitely to reduce that. In general, the definition of a simple problem is that you can see cause and effect clearly. And in terms of solving it, you have simple, easy pathways for intervening. So when you know the cause of the problem and you know what the effect is, so for example, I think about the street just down behind me where I walk my kids to school. We're only a couple of 100 meters away from school, and there's a street that a lot of cars have to drive through. It's not a main road, but it's a largish road, and well, it's certainly not. Okay, it's not a large road. It's a small suburban road, and there's a pedestrian crossing or a half pedestrian crossing for the kids up there. But there are a lot of near misses. Cars drive a little bit too fast, and people are rushing to drop their kids off and rushing to get away from there. But there are a lot of kids around. And so it's a simple problem in the sense that we can see that there are near misses and potentially kids maybe getting close to getting hit by cars and things like that. And we can see what the causes are. Cars are just going too fast, so we can intervene quite easily. Okay, let's go with complex problems. What might be some examples of more complex problems? Clubfoot. Yes, definitely. Vaccination's a solution, not a. I'll put climate change in a wicked problem. Sexism. Yeah, I think sexism is probably a complex problem. It's definable. We can see what it is. We can see a variety of causes and obviously a variety of effects. We don't have a simple place to intervene. We have to intervene in a lot of places to try and understand what is causing sexism, what might stop sexism. It's certainly, where we can put traffic calming measures on a street. That's a simple problem. A more complex problem, we have a variety of causes and a variety of effects, and probably a variety of places where we're required to intervene. Child abuse, probably the same, I think. Alcoholism, drug addiction. I wonder if they might be getting almost to wicked problems, some of those. Safe injecting rooms. So don't treat these as hard and fast. Treat these as a spectrum. Diagnosing a problem and saying it is simple or complex or wicked, it doesn't help you enormously, but it helps you to understand, okay, what are the range of things going on? I think the interesting thing, drug addiction, the difference with a wicked problem and a complex problem is when you have debate about the existence of the problem at all. When some people say, oh no, that's not a problem. Some people see the problem in a very different light. Some people understand the challenge in a very different way. And this is why drug addiction, or let's just be broader and say, where do I want to go with self-medication or chemicals for pleasure. Let's go chemicals for pleasure. That drug use has been a part of society for thousands of years. And different societies have responded in a variety of different ways. And there will be people right now who see various forms of drug use as not a problem. Other people saying, no, that is a big problem. So alcohol, for instance, there will be some people saying, look, we need to do a lot to get alcohol out of society. Other people saying, no, alcohol is society. Other people saying, no, it's fine. It's not an issue. Then we have a lot of different consequences and a lot of different causes. Then we have debate about which different forms of drugs are legitimate in different societies. Alcohol, coffee, marijuana, other drugs as well. And so that's a classic example of a wicked problem, because there is significant debate about whether any of those are, did I say coffee? I did say coffee. All right. Significant debate about which of those are problems or not. as Mia says there, in animal welfare, we think of a wicked problem as being where the solution requires a great number of people to change their mindset and behavior, going from intensive farming systems to meet demand for meat consumption. Absolutely. So all of these wicked problems, drug addictions or responses to drugs or climate change, our intervention points are incredibly varied. If we are to solve climate change, we need to not only change production systems, the cars we drive, the arrangements of our cities, the way that we relate to each other, all of those kinds of things, to the point that there is no one simple thing that we can do. All right, here's what we'll do. I'm going to give you breakout rooms and 10 minutes, in which time you can go spend a couple of minutes making a coffee, but meet your breakout room friends. And I want to know, where does COVID-19 fit on this graph? Simple, complex, or wicked? I'll put you in breakout rooms. Actually, I'll stop sharing. Okay, breakout rooms are open. Report back at 10:31. You can make a coffee and then chat. Where does COVID-19 fit on the complex to wicked problems chart? Buffalo Bill.
Hi, Will. My connection dropped out. I was in breakout room 12. If you're able to pop me back in there, please.
Yeah, can do.
Thank you.
Although it doesn't really, we're almost. Where are we? There we go. Breakout room 12.
Thank you.
You'll notice as you join back in, I've put up a poll there just so that we can see what the overall answer is.
Oops, that's the last of it. So it doesn't really matter anymore.
Okay, no one's brave enough to say that it's a simple problem. I think that would be quite a brave thing to argue. Oh, there we go. Those of you arguing that COVID-19 is a simple problem, can you tell me why you believe this to be the case? Anyone want to jump in? Two of you have said it's a simple problem on the poll. Ah, you voted for the simple for the lols. If only I could find out who voted and then I'd make you stand on your feet. Okay. Clearly, the more important debate between is those who consider it a complex problem and those who consider it a wicked problem. What elements of it lean it to being a complex problem? Who voted for that?
Yeah, I voted complex. I would have said the interaction with the public and the feel like, I'm unsure about using this word, but the obedience. Say in Victoria, at least, like I'm from Victoria, and it's just getting more and more strict. So they're it's all about the compliance with the public and following the guidelines. And say for instance, I work retail, and my managers were still telling me it was considered an essential service. And I was just I really can't see how pots and pans and all this stuff are essential service. And then it's all these economical complexities. But I don't consider it a wicked problem, mainly for me because I don't see it as a lethal, as lethal as say the bubonic plague. I'd say that was a wicked.
Well, here's the interesting thing, and I'll jump to you in a second, Stephanie. And there's some questions that I'd like to pick up on here. I think one of the interesting things about COVID-19 is the causes are simple. It's a pathogen. It's a pathogen that we can scientifically know, we can scientifically diagnose, and we can see and point to. Well, not see with microscopes, but see with diagnostic tests and then point to. Of course, it's a new pathogen, and so that adds to the level of complexity in the sense that we are not sure about it in the way that we are far more sure about the bubonic plague pathogen, or far more sure about the pathogens that have caused different diseases in the past, or those that are endemic in society. So the influenza kills a lot of people every year. and it evolves every year, but we have a pretty good understanding about what those causes are. Now, of course, we have this, the responses to it, whereas say influenza, we have society going on as normal, but we cope with it in a certain sort of way. Isolating people, treating people in certain sorts of ways. This is the fact that we are having to deal with this in a new way that we haven't done before, does point to being slightly more complex, slightly more wicked maybe. I did like that Mia said complex and a half. Stephanie, did you want to jump in now?
Yeah, similar. Basically, I'd say that in terms of a widespread contagion or new sickness, it's not wicked in that we have the basic infrastructure and normally we know what to do when sickness happens, and we are doing things in place to sort of minimize the spread. Ideally, you have a vaccine and then it's no problem. Until then, our temporary measures are, I mean, it's not simple because our temporary measures come at the cost of other things. So being in lockdown, and Zoe, who's in our breakout room, she's lived on a border town, and the border closures are causing a lot of problems and access to other healthcare.
Yeah.
And you can't, of course, keep these measures up forever. Basically,
Yep.
this is, our society is not equipped to handle this, and unless we have massive cultural change, there isn't a quick fix to this.
And deep down, we don't want our society to be permanently equipped to handle this. You know, we all do want society to mostly look like it did before when we do have a vaccine or something like that. So it's not like so for example, a climate change shift, there will be many people that say, no, we shift to a new normal and we want to stay in that new normal. We don't want to stay in a lockdown world. So yeah, I think it's definitely pathogen is down the simple end, but the complexity of our societal responses, because it is so big, much more down the complex, potentially wicked end. Belinda.
Yeah, hi, Will. I was just taking my hand down because I was going to say exactly the same thing because it fits. Oh, I can't take my hand down at the moment. Oh, yes, I can. Because, yeah, exactly like you said, you know, you can see the cause and effect clearly, and there are clear ways of addressing it. But, yeah, economic impact on people's mental health, all that stuff makes it wicked. So I'm a SIMKID. That's what I call it, a SIMKID problem.
SIMKID. Okay, no, I accept that, because I think the pathogen element of this is actually simple. You know, modern states have been set up for 200 years to see, diagnose, and attempt to do something about pathogens. It's not something like alcoholism or drug addiction that you can't see in a microscope so easily. So that end of it makes it simple. All the other things make it wicked or complex or wicked. Helen.
So I kind of really struggled whether to put this in wicked or complex. Will, I really couldn't quite make up my mind. It's definitely up there somewhere. The thing that I was struggling with the most is the fact that there is a large level of denialism around whether COVID exists. There's then denialism over how severe it is. And then there's denialism over what we should do in response to it, like whether we should just go for the herd immunity approach or whether we should actually try to eradicate it or whether we should just aim to slow it down. All of those elements for me kick it towards the more wicked end of the spectrum. But that said, I mean, yeah, it's a pathogen. We know what to do with pathogens. We've known for ages, right? It's just the problem here is really society. It's people.
Yeah, fascinating. Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that we're discussing it in August when the first case was reported last December suggests something about how wicked this problem is. And I think talking about it having a simple cause is understating it a little bit as well. There was a report that came out today that we may have been underestimating the amount of transmission in kids. So there are still discoveries being made. They're being made on the fly as people are getting sick and dying. I think that raises it to a level of urgency that also means the discussion is very hard to consistently have. The level of panic means that the discussion is very difficult to have, which adds to the complexity of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fair enough. Raina.
Yep. It's a good discussion. I want to propose that COVID is just another one, and there would be more down the pipeline, more infectious diseases. A lot of models predict that, and there was already some beforehand. And in the past, as Will said, you know, cities, for example, were designed around infectious disease control and things like that, and people were giving some thought in the design of the way we lived in our world on the impact of infectious diseases, but we've forgotten about that a little bit. So I think if you see COVID as the first one of other ones to come, and that if we cannot return to normal, and vaccines and drugs aren't the answer, but we have to fundamentally change the way we organize ourselves and the way we design our cities and that sort of things, that probably makes it a wicked problem. So I think in the moment, it's perhaps the fact that who would think that wearing a mask could be a political issue. The fact that these sorts of things are happening makes it more of a wicked issue, but it seems to be different in different cultures as well. So yeah, there is that aspect to it. There was some news on how Vietnam, at least up till recently, dealt with it really well. And they had been through already a series of these events, and so they had learned from the previous ones, and they also used some really good communication. So I think all sorts of stuff here.
It's actually a point that I'm going to come to in the slides in a second, Raina, that the same problem in different political contexts will be more wicked or more complex, potentially towards the more linear. And a great parallel there might be between Vietnam and the US. On one side, you have a country that has an authoritarian system of government that doesn't have a lot of room for dissent and debate. And in a public health emergency, was able to enact a variety of things and put in a variety of regulations, and also not a lot of debate about the existence of the problem. So in Vietnam, I would say COVID-19 is probably towards the more complex end, whereas you go into a country like the US, and we have elements of it here in Australia, where there is a significant debate about the nature of the problem, also significant debate about how machinery of government can come together to attempt to do things that does make a problem inherently more complex. Obviously, same thing, US society is inherently more complex. I wouldn't say inherently more wicked, but US society is inherently more complex than a smaller, more monocultural, more uniform systems of government. So that does add to this whole landscape. Mitchell.
Unmute. On the poll, I voted simple because I'm in quarantine, and when the crosses get to the end, then I finish. So that's very simple. But in our breakout discussion, we mentioned that like it depends very much on people's experiences on the ground. So even within Australia, we say like there is a lot of variation in do people discuss if it exists? To Helen's point, exactly, does it exist? What measures do we need, et cetera, et cetera. Melbourne is different right now to other jurisdictions like Western Australia, NT, South Australia, like Northern Queensland. There are basically no cases of community transmission. And so when it comes to getting people to decide what the consensus is, that's going to be different.
Cool. So I think one thing that's useful to bring in here in understanding the complexity of a problem is the levers that we have to pull, and we'll cover more on this in subsequent classes, but the levers that our government is able to pull to be able to deal with the problem. Simplest version, you know, you can put in a crossing, whereas in Vietnam, for example, a more authoritarian country, you are able to pull a certain variety of levers really quite quickly in terms of locking things down, requiring certain things. Harder to pull those levers in a country like the US. But it also depends not only on the rule-making ability of the country, but also trust in government. Will people follow the advice and rules of government? Samuel.
Yeah, I think our point has largely been covered, but we were sort of suggesting that although the cause might be considered simple, and there's definitely the conspiracy theory element, the thing that kind of sets this apart is who is espousing those conspiracy theories. So this time it seems to be coming sometimes right from the top. and media organizations as well, especially perpetuating narratives about the severity of it and how it's, you know, just a flu. And yeah.
Does it make a problem inherently more wicked if you have your president not contributing to solutions, shall we say? Sarah.
I just thought I really disagree with the idea that it would be a simple origin of the pathogen of coronavirus, because the cultural sort of factors leading to its sort of existence was the wet markets, the wildlife trade in China, and there was a lot of societal factors that allowed it to grow. And it was sort of this not learning in China from SARS. And I think it's sort of interesting I'd study international relations. It's an interesting way to look at the political factors that led to its origin. And then I had a question for you. When looking at the difference between complex and wicked for COVID-19, do we take COVID-19 purely as this virus and just like, I'm getting that other person sick, the solutions are wearing a mask, washing hands? Or do we look at these broader international impacts, such as the impact on the global economy, the exacerbation of inequalities in communities, and sort of those vulnerabilities? How do we manage that in?
I'll just address the first point first about the origin of disease, and then I think it's a fascinating question there about entangling these problems. Firstly, on the origin of COVID, I think it's a fascinating thing, and I think it's well worth exploring. My point about it being simple is not that it had a simple origin, more that we are able to see pathogens, viruses, bacteria, in a way that we can't see a variety of other both health problems and also complex societal problems. You know, we can know if someone has COVID or not, and then we can respond to that. Now, then wrapping into this whole thing, can we disentangle COVID from COVID, the disease, and the response to the disease from everything else? I think here's the thing: governments never deal with problems in pure isolation. And this has been one of the big problems of 20th century governance, has been an attempt to try and say, okay, transport departments deal with transport, and our job is to optimize how fast we get around town and screw everything else. And then that obviously does a lot of damage to public health outcomes or something like that. But I think surely when we can see that our leaders, Scott Morrison, is attempting as much as possible to grapple with both the initial problem, but also the consequences of the solution. And your doctor would be the same on a different sort of issue. You know, for example, if you are taking a medication for X, there may be side effects. How do you deal with those side effects? You might take it something else, or you might do some sort of behavior therapy or whatever it is. That if we don't attempt to deal with the consequences of our solutions, then we are just going to be having more and more problems. So I think we can't divorce these things. We can certainly have epidemiologists or virologists and immunologists who might say, okay, my job is to focus on the virus, but they are never going to be entirely divorced from the wider social response that includes how do we limit transmission between different people? How do we keep as many jobs so that we aren't suffering through all of this as much as possible? So I would say when the history books are written of COVID-19, it would not be a book purely on virology. It would be a book on what everything that happened with society at this time. Ali.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to expand on what Helen said in regards to it being a wicked problem, because there's still a lot of issues with people denying the fact that it's a problem at all. And I think it kind of has a complex interplay with the erosion of trust in, say, the media and the erosion of trust in the government. And I think in societies where we can see that there is that erosion of trust in the media and the government, it's really hard for that messaging to get across about, you know, the solutions and how serious it is. Even just in my, you know, experience working as a journalist, it's really hard to kind of you encounter a lot of people who think, oh, well, it's not a big deal. You guys should stop writing about this so much, you know? Like, I get comments on the comment section on the Facebook page for the newspaper I write for saying, like, why do you guys keep talking about COVID? Like, there's people who just seriously deny that it's a big problem and want us to stop talking about it. And of course, there's the whole thing with some media outlets downplaying it, some media outlets putting out more and more about it. And it's really hard because there's that lack of trust in the media for whatever reason, many reasons. But yeah, it's lack of trust in the government, lack of trust in health care system now with more rise in anti-vaxxing. So that lack of trust, it definitely makes it a wicked problem.
I think that's a great point, Ali. I think if you were to imagine a time where there was higher trust in government and media, and there probably was, you know, there's certainly trust in government has gone up and down and is very historically contingent. But say in the 50s and 60s here in Australia or the US, there was higher trust in government. Also a time probably of higher trust in media, not that they weren't covering over a whole bunch of problems. But I would say if COVID had happened then, you would have different forms of societal response to what we are seeing now. Absolutely, absolutely. We are definitely in a moment of low trust in both government and media. But then you can see, here's the clear example of the difference. I would say Australia's trust in media and Australia's trust in government is probably both higher than the US. I don't think that's a terribly controversial thing to say. And therefore that has probably led to the difference in our societal responses. Now there's other things going on, of course, there's geography and health systems and things like that. But I think that probably people are more likely to do, you know, what is asked of them if they do trust that governments do have their best intentions and that media tell the truth. I think that there are certainly countries where that is not the case. So I think it's a great point that in low trust, we have problems becoming more wicked. And in a sense, some problems become endemic at that point. You can't solve them because you don't have organs to solve. Simon. Just before you go, Simon, I just saw that question there. Trust in government re bushfires. Yes. You know, I would say that the Australian response, Australian view of how our governments have responded to COVID has been very much, okay, yeah, they've done probably mostly the right thing and done pretty well. I don't think anyone is deeply in love, or maybe not, there will be some people hostile, but I think if we compare that with the response to the bushfire crisis over in summer, a time when a lot of people felt really quite abandoned, we have a very different response. So, you know, trust is you know, ongoing. People have a trust in government, but definitely in different issues, it manifests in different ways. Now, Simon.
Yeah, I sort of, the way I've been thinking about this whole COVID thing in relation to what you were talking about here is kind of like the best science fiction is setting up some sort of situation where it reveals something about ourselves or our society. And I feel like COVID's sort of done that. And the two things I wanted to add to the discussion were the fact that we're relying on young people to do the right thing because it doesn't really affect them as much.
Yep.
And it's like, what are they getting for it? But they're not getting affordable housing. They're not really getting a good future. They're going to have to pay for this mess. And the other thing, just because I am in the north, and this is totally just living in this area, is that a lot of Muslim communities, the Muslim community here, doesn't actually feel accepted. And so when they have cultural things they want to do, they don't listen. And I feel like it's a political problem where there are people who haven't been included and it didn't really matter because we didn't need to pull together like this. But when it comes to the situation of like, oh, COVID's gone and we don't need to worry about it, then they put their culture over something else and then we end up getting problems.
I think it's a great point to make there that COVID has exposed a lot of problems that people recognized in society, but perhaps people said, whatever. You know, I think the classic example of this, and it really cuts to the core, is people who in precarious forms of employment, many of you may have been in that situation, are in that situation, precarious forms of employment, prioritizing work over over either their health or the health of others. And I think here's a key thing. Anyone in the public health community who doesn't recognize people will do that is delusional, because people have bills to pay. People they want to keep a roof over their head for their family. They want to feed their family. And that is a very, very dominant value. You know, I think for a lot of people, making sure that there is food on the table is an intensely important thing. And so here, when you have incredibly precarious employment with no COVID-19 leave, with no support structures, then you have people that'll say, all right, I'm gonna lie about it. I'm gonna take, what's that, Codral? Remember, that ad will never come back. Codral, you can soldier on. Take the pills and you can go to work. Wow, whoo, that ain't coming back. But there would be people who in precarious forms of employment who will say, oh, I'll just go to work because I need to put food on the table. Terrible from a public health standpoint. And so here is where we have to recognize that COVID-19 has been made worse by elements of our societal makeup. Clearly, you know, when we have groups such as you said before, you know, migrant communities who feel not a lot of trust or not as enmeshed in society as they could do, then you don't get those levels of trust. So I think, you know, because COVID is so big, such a society spanning problem, then you guaranteed it is exacerbated by a lot of the problems that have happened before. Now, you know, maybe this is the deep example that means governments, advocates around the world are going to say, hang on, them being precarious actually makes me sicker or potentially sicker. Oh, maybe I should start caring about that. Maybe. But it does change things enormously. And I think that's a great point to look at. Belinda.
Hey, yeah, look, just following on from what you were saying about those trust issues, I found it really fascinating that people have been very uncomfortable with the risk management side of it, that we have incomplete information about what's going on. And so the way the government's been talking about it has not been definitive. It's been, well, you know, we think that, you know, masks could be better, this could be better, that could be better. And so there's a real tension between the people who are resenting the imposition on their personal freedoms and a whole group of, you know, another part of the community that's saying, I don't want to make personal decisions. Tell me what to do. I don't understand. I don't like the risk. You know, that the vagueness of the risk management approach. Tell me what to do. And I found watching that fascinating.
Absolutely. I think this is another thing that points it to being a more complex end of the scale, is when we can't give clear instructions. The clearest of problems, you're in a building that's on fire and you just got to leave. And so the clearest form of communication is run. You know, that is by far the clearest form of communication. Not many problems are at that sort of level. Many more problems, COVID-19 in particular, we're not quite sure what the best advice is, particularly the best advice when we have to juggle the rest of our lives. So yes, we could get rid of this whole disease in 3 weeks if no one in the whole world went anywhere other than, you know, even in your own house. You know, you live or die, and just everyone's permanent full lockdown. Yes, but we can't do that. And so we have to live in a world that is suboptimal in terms of solving any problems, because there is everything else going on there as well. Now, does anyone have any more comments to say on that? Because I think this is a really important thing to say. I don't think it is essential at any moment that we need to understand, is a problem diagnosably simple or complex or wicked? I think what is important for us to do is to understand that problems come on a spectrum. They come on a spectrum from things that we can understand the causes and the effects and the intervention points, to things where they're a little bit muddly or there's a lot of debate about them. So all problems are different, and they will be different in different contexts. Amelia? Do we have you, Amelia?
Sorry, unmuted now. I guess I was just going to say that it's also a global issue, which means that even if we are to do everything right in terms of handling the problem, forces outside of our control or the way that other countries handle COVID could actually mean that it becomes our wicked problem as well. So there's really no way to isolate yourself from what's happening elsewhere. So I think that does make it very difficult to manage. And every country has to develop their own policies that are relevant to their position in the global world as well. And that will really change what they're doing.
One of the classic reasons that climate change is a wicked problem is that we're only really going to solve it if we solve it as a globe. It's one particular country could turn their emissions to zero, and there's plenty of countries that are on carbon neutral trajectories, and actually even are there. You look at Iceland or New Zealand or Denmark's doing pretty well. Anyway, plenty of countries that do that, but that doesn't solve the problem if they are buying in manufactured goods from countries that have a very high carbon intensity. You're just shipping your carbon overseas. So climate change has to be solved at a global level. We have to do it with everyone involved. And that makes it incredibly hard to get agreement. Similarly, COVID requires us to deal with this at a global level. We can close borders so that theoretically you can go, all right, well, no one comes in or out forever, and we can keep ourselves completely disease-free. And in fact, if there was like a zombie plague sort of thing where it was permanent and there's no solution, I think closing the borders would be probably a big part of our solution, and that would just be the new normal. But clearly, global problems make a big difference. Okay, I'm going to continue with the rest of the things that I just wanted to get through, and then we'll pivot to an exploration example of a much simpler problem now, it turns out, when I've been looking at this. So I'll just share my screen again. Okay, as I said before, and as this whole example has shown, the pathway for any policy starts with a problem. When we discover a problem, when a problem is revealed to us. Now, problems, of course, vary enormously in complexity, from simple through to wicked. But as we said before, said throughout that chat just then, the geography and the jurisdiction matter. And here, for example, is the difference between different countries in their response to COVID. There is a vast difference between China, Vietnam, the US, and New Zealand. They have very different geographical and governmental particularities that mean how they deal with a problem will be very different. New Zealand has a giant moat. China and the US and Vietnam do not. China and Vietnam have different sorts of government, different levels of trust in government that perhaps the US might not. So every country must deal with every problem in the way that is germane to both their own history and their own geographical context. We can't take a problem and say it will be exactly the same in another country. However, we can of course draw a lot of parallels. If we in Australia want to solve drug addiction or something like that, we can definitely learn from other countries. But the things that go into people's use of drugs will be different in different countries, and so may mean different things. All of this just to say is that it's contingent. The next thing that's clear from COVID, from climate change, is that we will never be able to solve a problem if we don't take account of all of the different interests and stakeholders who are involved in any solution. So going back to the original problem that I raised this morning, the CFC problem, that was solvable in part because a replacement chemical was invented, and industry was both worried by the chance that they could get sued, that they could get pointed to as, hey, you put this chemical out here has caused an increase in cancer, and that they had a solution. It's very difficult for fossil fuel companies to pivot to not digging fossil fuel out of the ground when 99% of their expertise is all doing that. So that's what makes climate change more difficult to solve than the hole in the ozone layer. We need to take account of everyone that is involved in both causing a problem and potentially solving a problem if we are to understand what's going on. This is something that we have covered enormously in both the COVID response and climate change response, that we have to start thinking about the certainty of different problems. Now, in the hole in the ozone layer, we got, by the end of the 1970s, a pretty good scientific understanding of what is going on in the problem. But there is a lot of problems where we don't have anywhere near that level of certainty. I think COVID, we have a high level of certainty. Climate change, we have a high level of certainty. But some of the others, so for example, sexism, we don't have a whole lot of certainty on all of the different causes that are causing the problem. But here's the thing. We have to be very careful in the scientific world of letting politicians say, I only act on certain information. That's not true. It's not true in our lives, and it's not true of governments. Governments always make decisions based on risk. They make decisions based on, okay, how likely is that scenario to happen? How likely is this other scenario to happen? What should I do? How hard is it to cross the road? What are my risks here? And what should I do about this? So for a classic example of this is that no country has ever needed to build an army or even go to war based on a certain understanding of what their enemy is going to do, because you never have a certain understanding of what an enemy is going to do. Instead, governments will work on the idea of, okay, we have a risk with an enemy here, a threat or a problem, and therefore we should start doing things in this sort of direction. I've often said that one of the key things that science provides is, of course, we provide the triple bottom line sorts of things to society. We provide economic benefits, we provide social benefits, and we provide health benefits. Clearly we can, and environmental benefits. But flipping that around, we also provide society with a way of understanding risks that might be a reserve capacity. It's like the Hollywood meteorite expert who will never be called on except in the rare case that there is a meteorite coming to Earth. Science provides a lot of understanding of the risks that we face. So I think in all of our work, we should be careful about ever saying that action has to be predicated on a certain understanding of a problem. Instead, action can take place based on risk. And so here is a useful thing for us to think about in terms of what sorts of information is useful for governments to make decisions. Now, governments do not need certain information to make decisions, and they never will, but they might say out loud they'd like it. Of course, everyone would like certain information. You like certain information about whether to take that job or this job, or to do this degree or that degree, or buy that house or this house. It doesn't exist. You have to be based on what you think might happen and probabilities and risk. This is a nice framework to think about. Okay, can that information help us to make decisions? And this is a criteria. I'll put this paper up in the Wattle afterwards. McNee raises 3 characteristics of what is useful information. The first is that for information to be useful, it has to be relevant to the specific context in which it will be used. So for example, there is plenty of information about COVID. We need to know, is any particular information going to help us making decision points going forward? Second, of course, it must be credible and dependable. It's got to be accurate and valid and high quality. That helps us to understand if it's useful. And the third, is it going to be free of political bias? Now, I'm going to use this example for you to do an exercise. What I'd like you to do is and these slides are available in Wattle, so you can go back to this in Wattle, is I'm going to raise a hypothetical, or it's a semi-hypothetical actually, because it's based on a real life story. And I'd like you to understand, like you to work together in groups to work out, okay, what is the relevant information? What is the information I need to be able to diagnose and understand this problem and work out what we need to do next? So the challenge is a doctor in a small town, and this is based on Mount Isa in Queensland, a small mining town, has noticed elevated levels of lead in children's blood. Now, what do we need to do next? What is needed to reveal the problem? How complex is the problem? What jurisdictions might be relevant? What stakeholders might be relevant? What's needed to solve the problem? I'll leave these slides up, but I'm going to give you 20 minutes. You can spend 5 minutes having a break and then report back at 11:30, and then we'll have a conversation. So this is a semi-hypothetical. Doctor has noticed elevated levels of lead in children's blood. Can you find out what 5 things, or discuss what 5 things will be needed to solve the problem? Do you want to go back into the same groups as before or new groups?
Good. New groups.
New groups. All right, let's recreate. Recreate all rooms. Okay. Rooms are open. Come back at, so you can get these slides off Waddle, or I'll just leave my screen up there that you can see it. Take 5 minutes as a break, and then we'll come back at 11:30 and discuss that. Welcome back.
I love your jumper, Will. Is that hand knitted?
It is hand knitted, not by me, by a friend's mum. She had an awesome one, and I praised it so much that it got back to her mum, and she said, "Well, I'll knit you one." And I'm like, "That would be the best thing in the world."
Oh no! Yeah, you heard my praise, and now you want to send me one?
I
What a
know.
surprise! I know.
I don't know which culture it is. It might be some South Pacific culture. If you praise something, then you have to give it to them. So maybe she's got a bit of that. I don't know, but yes.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, it was quite wintry out there before. Not so bad now.
Mm.
Okay, welcome back. Thank you very much. So for this last section, I'd just like to explore, just to think through what is needed to reveal a problem adequately. So can you tell me a little bit about what sorts of things you all talked about in your groups? I don't know the best way to do this. Normally in a room, I would just say one by one, tell us a little bit about what you were talking about. I could go, what does group one, but I don't know if you all remember your group numbers. And I didn't ask anyone to be spokesperson. So let's just go through. Tell me a few things that you were talking about in what is necessary to reveal this problem. Group one, if you remember your group.
I can
I
go
got
on.
some hand. Yep.
Oh, Helen, you.
Simon, Tamara, I think, and Eric. I think Tamara has some notes on what we talked about in terms of how you go about identifying the problem. I don't know if you can hear the construction noise, so I don't want to be the person to talk.
I heard something, yeah.
I can take over.
Yeah, I've got renovations going on, so if someone else from our group wants to take this, I'm going to mute myself.
It sounds like not renovations, but sort of a baby whale being born or something like that.
That would honestly be preferable. I've had both of the apartment above us and the one next to us having renovations for the last 2 weeks. So Wales would be a welcome change.
Cool. All right. Was that Tamara? Were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I'll do it. So we kind of talked about the complexity of it a lot. And we got talking about kind of cross-benefit analysis and, talking about is the wealth of a situation better than the well-being. So we're talking about if, for example, that the lead poisoning was like in a playground, is it worth to continue to keep that playground there because more children are going to get sick and therefore that leads to more money in the health system as opposed to considering like the well-being of the children. So we talked about that quite a lot, and also the different kind of stakeholders. So we probably had like 3 kind of dominant one being the kids, the parents taking care of the kids, and also how it was going to be solved. So if it was like a playground, would it be the government taking over? But then could be further branched out into like health systems, who caused it, any like kind of lawyers and lawsuits that has to happen. Yeah, I think they were the main kind of things we talked about.
Great. So straight away, you can see the sorts of information that you do need include things like where is it, what might be the causes? Is it in playgrounds or is it geographically located to a school or a certain street? You can't act until you know a little bit more about, okay, what's going on here. We only know, the only bit that I've given you is elevated lead in children's blood, but it would be ridiculous to go in and dive with a solution when you don't know the chain of cause for the problem. Helen, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I was in breakout group 7, I think. I might have misremembered that. I've been 5, Mia? 5? Okay, sorry, 5. I was in number 5. Apologies to everyone in breakout group 7. And we talked a little bit about trying to understand, first of all, where the problem came from, So things like, was it from the water supply to the town? Is it from a local mine, for example? Is it from industry? Is it from lead paint? Is it just in the air? So there's a bit of exploratory sort of, discovery you've got to do to find out what's actually causing the problem, because that will tell you which stakeholders need to be involved and what the solutions might be. And so we're talking about things like our stakeholders would be not just parents and children. It could potentially be the industries in the town. It could potentially be the health resources, things like pollution agencies, national health departments, etc., etc. It's kind of everyone potentially, and it depends how widespread the problem is and how big it is and where it's coming from. Because if it is industry, you can then also have knock-on effects to employment and income in the area. So it could lead to a whole bunch of other problems if you try to solve the lead problem. It can actually flow onto a lot of other crap, to use a technical term. And in terms of what's needed to solve the problem, we went for the good old joined up approach across multiple areas of society. There's this, fundamental interconnectedness of all things sort of solution where everyone is part of the solution, potentially, depending upon what the problem actually is.
So how much do you reckon, and other people can jump in at this point, and I will come to people with their hands up, how much do you reckon stakeholders should be involved in the problem discovery process?
I'm a big fan of co-design.
Yep.
Which means that I think as soon as you think you've found a social problem, you should start telling people about it so that they can be part of the solution. Mm-hmm. Because when you're talking about social problems, if you don't get people on board, they sometimes feel like they're just being told what to do and how to think and how to react, instead of actually feeling like they can be part of the design of a solution.
And here I want to...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, you go.
Oh, no, I think there's kind of an extent to which you should really be careful depending on who the stakeholders are, right? Because otherwise, with things like mining, you get all these industry-sponsored research papers which are showing, oh, actually, this isn't really a big deal. So I think it really, depending who the stakeholders are, you need to be really cautious about involving them in the discovery process, because they will, of course, come in with their biases and their kind of, preconceived ideas of what they want the outcome of the discovery to be.
I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm not gonna tell you what the answer has to be, because it would be something that varies a lot. From that perspective that Helen raised there, co-design is an integral part of involving science in society and probably coming to good solutions. But of course, the risk that we have here is, what you can see from the picture I put up there. Mount Isa, in this hypothetical version, is a one company town, and the one company is the mine. And the key stakeholder in terms of mining interests is, that nearly everyone is employed there. The whole town depends for its lifeblood on that mine. Now, the classic idea of science, and the science that will be done here is some sort of either epidemiology or public health science or something like that, is to remain as objective as possible. To say, okay, we as scientists, maybe the doctor themselves, or they recruit in a team from the state environmental protection agency or state public health bodies or something like that, recruit in a team, and then they do the science. You go, okay, let's look at a whole bunch of kids, whole bunch of playground schools, whatever. Let's try and find out what's going on here. But if you're not co-designing with the town, then you're going to make a whole lot of mistakes. You get some outsiders to come in and start doing soil samples, and then the town says, yeah, but no one ever plays there. Like that's no good. So there's a great tension here between how much we should involve all stakeholders towards getting a solution, versus if we involve stakeholders that may be antagonistic to a solution, maybe they can derail it. I don't know if there is an answer to that, but we in the sciences need to be aware that as we involve people have interests, and those interests may pull in various directions. Daniel.
I was just I think we're in group 8. Just to build on what you said there though too, Will, I find it, it's a balance of putting it out there for everyone to know about and actually trying to find the cause. And, there's been plenty of examples in the past where corporations or companies are doing the wrong thing. And if you put it out there too soon that something might be going on, then maybe they might, you know, as you're saying, they have their own interests and you may not necessarily find the root cause of it. But I guess going back to what we did, it really for us was based on what the evidence was showing us. So, you know, what was the size of the population being affected? How did that compare to the baseline? How did that compare to then other, you know, areas? Because then it gives you a good snapshot of what's actually going on. And then from there, we built out like almost like a circular, you know, where is that population? What's connected to that population? And then engage with those stakeholders there. And then depending on the size, then that would then depend on the stakeholders. So if it became you know, if the size of the issue was so large that you might need to engage with state government then instead of just local government. And then if it's bigger than that, then it could be a more of a widespread thing. So then federal government. So I guess like it really just everything depended on the evidence and depended on that sample. So yeah, I know it sounds a bit wishy-washy, but it was like, well, everything's, you know, it all depends on that.
No, but I think the key thing here is it does depend on the evidence. And what we've got here, I've given you the barest hunch. You know, and this is where problems start. They start with a small hunch from potentially a scientist, potentially a doctor, potentially engaged citizen or something like that, where they say, that's really weird. Now, this could fall apart well, not fall apart. A doctor notices elevated levels of lead in children's blood. Now, by elevated, does it mean it's 1% above the background rate and it's not a problem until it reaches 30%? No, I don't know those stats at all. But elevated does not mean problematic. Elevated could mean problematic if there are other studies out there that show this. And amongst how many children is this? So I think, you know, we have to always say, you start with a hunch. The world always starts with a hunch of, let's go and look. Now, of course, in a mining town like that, it's a lead and silver mining town. Maybe people are hypervigilant to this kind of stuff. And so your hunches are never divorced from what was going on in the town behind. But you need to flesh this out and you need to do that lit review and say, okay, what are the consequences of this? What are other populations like? What's going to go on there?
Just to build on what you're saying there, Will, like if you immediately said, okay, it's got to be the mine, who knows? It could be like what we saw with the fuel. It could be a nationwide thing, and these are the first people seeing the effects of it. So you could spend all your time and effort trying to, you know, or making the assumption it's got to be this because it's right there, but without comparing it and talking to other, I guess, populations, you could be putting all your energy into the wrong thing.
I think that's a really important point. So yes, I mean, as Patricia said, there's no known safe lead concentration in the blood. Yes, that's important for this taking forward. But very much, you know, is this something that you're in a town where people are being hypervigilant to this and therefore noticing it first, but it's a national, perhaps global issue with you know, Thomas Midgley putting it in the petrol, or is this something that is unique to your jurisdiction? So this is classic science. There is no real science without comparison. And so what you might be comparing are a whole bunch of different things. Children now versus children in the past in that town, or children in this suburb versus that suburb versus that suburb versus that suburb, children who go to that school versus that school, children from that town versus another town in the same state, another town in the same country, other countries, children versus adults. There are so many places that we need to get that comparison before we can know if this is a problem. Rainer.
Yeah, but a lot of what we said within our group, which I think was group 7, was that has already been covered. But one thing I would like to say that we've talked about, there's one thing which makes this simple, and that is that it's lead. And the effects of lead have been very well described. And as a matter of fact, there are no safe levels for lead in blood in children. Any amount of lead is bad, and there is no safe levels established for that one, because the effect on mental developments are basically unequivocal. So in a way, you're in a good position from a communication point of view that nobody can say it doesn't matter or you know, who cares. While if you dealt with something like say flame retardants or something like that. Like, I don't know if you remember the PFOS thing.
Is that the couches?
No, that's people were using it for firefighting around the country, and especially in Air Force bases. And then it got into the water, and there was a contamination. It was an election issue, actually. And the one thing I wanted to add is that when do you involve people and at what level can be with contaminants can be a complex question. While I think you should be open about stuff, you also don't want to create panic when you don't need to. I've been involved in a number of food contamination issues. I was also involved in the PFOS work as I did some of the modeling for it. And what happened is in those places is that the government agreed that everybody gets tested before they knew what to actually do about it. If they find it in someone, there was no way forward. So I've got it in my blood, so what now? Is that actually constructive? Do you just want to know and then, but there is no action you can take? The health effects weren't really clear. And what happened in a lot of those places is people basically lost the value of their land, went to virtually nothing, and people had gone there to retire and they wanted to sell the land off to downsize and things, and all of a sudden all their wealth was gone. And there was all sorts of issues, and it had all these unintended consequences from turning it into sort of a panicky thing. Not wanting to downplay it, but I think it's important when there's a contamination thing, especially when it's localized, to also be careful about that you actually have a plan of action and people can actually do something about it. Another good example was things like melamine and issues like, what was the stuff that went into food packaging? I was involved in that too. I've wiped it from my mind. BPA.
BPA. Yeah.
BPA, and even now, I imagine I have to admit I've got skin in the game, but even now I think that the health effects haven't been. It's really unclear, and yet that's been basically taken out of the food supply, and in some cases been replaced with worse stuff. So it's always worthwhile to think this through and to be careful with your communication. Besides from that, I think our consensus in the group was how complex it is depends on the evidence, and also who needs to be involved depends on the evidence. And also, if it's a local issue or if it's in several jurisdictions, the Commonwealth might get involved, and then it gets complicated very quickly.
I think some great points there, Raina. And one of the key things that we in the sciences and science communication very, very, very much need to raise is that for all problems, we start with a hunch, and we need to flesh that out with more information. But at what point should we start acting? And I think, for your PFOS example, there wasn't a plan of action, so we're flawed in what we're going to do. But should we sit around? There's elevated lead in the children's blood. Should we sit around and say, all right, well, we need to do more science. We need to do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years more science before we can do anything? Or do we need to act and then act based on the risk and then think about what we can do after that? Now, there isn't a hard and fast rule on that. There's not something where we can say, yes, act now, regardless, because there are clearly, not just this example, but all scientific problem examples, always going to be other things that need to be taken into account and other issues. But we can't sit around for forever working out to get the perfect science. The classic example, of course, is no one ever did a randomized control trial on parachutes. Patricia.
Yeah, so regarding the how to act and how you act and the mitigation of the risk, in this case is kind of clear, like the risk is high, the evidence says that is basically that's it. Like if you have lead, things are going to happen and that's it. But I think in this particular case and in many others, the source of the polluted is a very important bit. It's like it's not the same if this contamination came from exposure to lead air particles that if it's from a different source. Like one of the biggest sources of lead contamination in Europe, it was pipes. The pipes were made of lead. And it was like 25% of the pipes were made of lead. And so if you identify where the risk is coming from, the complexity of the issue gets modified. and the way that you mitigate it also gets modified. And you can have like, because in this one you can think, oh, it's a mining town, is the mining that is causing the problem. It might be that the problem is somewhere else and you're acting on the mining.
Absolutely. And in a sense, you can imagine one of the purposes of science is obviously to go from hunch to clarified picture of what is going on, or to go from, oh, something's worrying and potentially complex, to removing complexity, to say, okay, it's not that. We've ruled out that that pathway. We've ruled out that intervention. We found out it's this, it's these houses, these pipes. We just replace these pipes. Now, of course, it's rarely that simple, but as much as possible, a goal of any policymaker would be to use information to reduce complexity, to say, okay, we can get down to a place where it is just pull this lever and that's what we get. Now, not very many problems can actually be reduced to a hyper simple one lever thing, but as much as possible, science can play that key role in moving from complex down towards simple. And that is a key thing in any policy decision. Of course, you know, this comes into that point of scientists should never buy into the logic of scientists provide certainty and simple solutions, because some things require action and some things cannot be reduced to a simple problem. Does anyone have any final questions on that, or anything you'd like to explore or raise that your group raised? Well then, I think that probably brings us to an understanding a little bit about how problems emerge, how problems are seen, and what we need to do to take them to the policymaking process. We will explore over the next few weeks pathways for taking the idea of a problem into what we can actually do about it, what we can use to address things, but that will give us a good start. So from here, have a look at the topics that are listed down below. I think I'll put the final dates on those final two topics in the next day or two, and then I'll add in all the guest speakers. But any questions, shoot them to me. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.